Archaeodeath, walking in the footsteps of past funerals.
Welcome, Archaeodeathlings, to this latest Archaeodeath interview, where I'm joined by Andy, all the way from the very southwest tip of Britain. Andy, please introduce yourself to our viewers and listeners, and welcome.
I'm well, actually, I'm not from Cornwall originally, but I've been down here for, I suppose, about 30 odd years now. I was initially coming down for a week's contract, and the west of Britain, the west of Britain, I think, sort of tends to hold people. If you like it, if you get on with it, you kind of you settle in and embed yourself, I think.
Oh, it's a wonderful
But
part of the world,
yeah.
I must admit the most recent interactions I've had with you is pestering you for peer reviews when I was archaeological journal
Oh, of
editor,
course, yeah, that's
and
right.
and, and,
Yes.
and, and or various advice on peer reviews or something. I can't remember exactly last, but so it's been over long since I've touched base and said hello properly, and just it's so nice to see you and have a chat. And
Yeah, it's great to see you.
so how did you get into archaeology in the first place, Andy, and what is your
Well,
role now?
I think, how I got into the first place, I suppose it was, I mean, I had a very, very long-standing interest in the sort of history and archaeology of the area I grew up in. And I grew up sort of, for people in that kind of close to the borderlands with Wales and Herefordshire, that kind of area. And it's an area which is chocker with hill forts, chambered tombs, the Cotswold Seven just the other side of the valley. So it was a really rich area. My father was particularly into sort of taking up sea earthwork, so it was always mulling there in the background as a fascination. Um, actually, and I'd actually applied. And I went to which university now to go and do an undergraduate degree in it, but for one reason or another, I decided to defer
Okay.
and ended up sort of enjoying myself for a little bit out of academia, and then got into what was then in the late 80s or mid to late 80s was with all the MSc schemes. I don't know if Manpower Services Commission, which a lot of archaeologists of my generation went to, and that doing that for a year or two really inspired me because I was getting my hands dirty and really enjoying it, and that inspired me to want to go back into academia again. From then on, sort of went on through Bournemouth and then Sheffield and then Exeter, where I met you, I think for the first time back in the late 90s, probably.
Yeah, back in the day, yes, must have been
Yeah,
early
yeah,
noughties. Yeah, yeah.
yeah, yeah. And Cornwall, and I was like a lot of people. I was a jobbing archaeologist here and there for a long time, and then mid 90s, I got a contract to work in Cornwall. Initially, I think it was just a week long, actually, on a rescue excavation, and from there on, I started off as a kind of site digger, and now I'm sort of running the archaeological unit. So 30 years later,
Wow, what a journey! And so
a
you're
journey,
you're
yeah.
sort of officially head of archaeology
So
type.
I'm projects manager. I think the current title is. It gets changed every couple of years or so, but at the moment it's projects manager because that's the current title. But
Fantastic.
yeah.
So what kind of work does that involve? What type of things do you get up to?
Well, these days, I have to say I'm very much desk based. I'm like a lot of people doing a lot of admin and a lot of oversight of projects, and which is kind of well, I suppose as you'll know, how you can't spend as much time in the field as you like to anymore,
No.
but you do get oversight of what's going on, which so it's a kind of it's a swings and roundabouts, I suppose. So you know, I probably couldn't work an 8 hour day outside anymore anyway, if I'm honest with myself. But I do get to see what's going on, and that's great because then that allows me to kind of think about the data that's going through. So it's a good position to be in, actually, because
Fantastic.
yeah,
Fantastic. And there's lots of exciting ongoing projects which we obviously
and there's
won't
lots of
talk about.
exciting.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because they're ongoing, and
Yeah.
things have to be kept within sort of reasonable wraps. But I mean, you've been working. Your research interests have been very much on burial archaeology, which is one of the things that obviously I've
Yeah.
seen you've obviously worked on some really important archaeological finds over the years. I don't even know where to start with this topic because there's so much to it. But I mean, so I defer to you. What would you say have been some of the key things that you've been exploring in terms of prehistoric or burial archaeology over the
Well,
years?
well, it's mostly in the Bronze Age because
Yeah.
I mean, actually I started off really being interested in the Neolithic, partly because all the chamber tombs I've been going to visit as when I was young. But uh, what you actually realise is when you're in the far southwest, as indeed in Wales, is that there's very few of the dead actually survive in this part of the world from the Neolithic. Occasionally little bits of cremated bone, but that's about it really. So, and then my attention sort of swung into when I realised that the majority of monuments are actually Bronze Age anyway, and then thinking more closely about what was going on in the burial record. We're suddenly getting this kind of upsurge around about 2000 BCE. We're getting a kind of massive upsurge in sort of burial activity. But what actually interested me was that it was the narratives that were being told I found were disappointing in many ways, and because they were very reductionist, I think. So, and sort of everything was always just a vague echo of what was being done in the better known regions of England, predominantly. And I could see there were very, very strong divergences from those patterns. So that's what got me really, really hooked, I suppose.
So there was like kind of this, just to capture the intellectual baggage of that maybe people aren't aware of, is that any period of the human past you get this kind of the core areas that get the attempt. And Wessex always dominates, but Wessex in a very non-peninsular sense of very much sort of the core Wiltshire where barrow diggers were doing their barrow digging.
Exactly.
Is that a fair way of putting it?
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's very succinctly put. That's right. So the focus is always on elites, high status burial grave goods, and those kinds of telling those very kind of simple stories. When in actual fact, the archaeological record, from my perspective, is very much more complex than that. And actually, the challenge is to think about different ways about how people view their deceased. We know from the ethnographical record that there are many different takes with even quite small areas, and these are changeable over time as well. So, trying to stamp this one, right, we understand what's going on at a very specific moment on Salisbury Plain, onto the rest of Britain, just seemed to me, as I say, very reductionist, but also, not challenging,
Well, I rightly take a lot of flack as an early medieval archaeologist for the many nonsense terms and frameworks that we have, but then when I hear prehistorians do it, I go pot kettle. You got your technological terms from the early 19th century. You're still trying to
yes.
Jam the evidence into the Bronze Age, or Bronze Age people do this. And all right, okay, for popular audiences, you need to do some of that generalization. But if you're an expert like you working in a field, you notice you've got variations and practices that don't appear in the core narratives of your own discipline. That's where you prompts you to do that further research, doesn't it? And
that's it, exactly right. Yeah.
So what did you find? What do you find were the key differences for?
So I mean, what you found? I mean, basically, what people were doing was they were looking at similar shaped monuments, predominantly round barrows in Cornwall, and then looking at ones predominantly in Salisbury Plain, for example, but not exclusively. And then saying A looks like B, therefore, even though we don't have the data from Cornwall, they must be the same. Or they'd get a pot which looked a bit like one from somewhere else and say this means the same in this society as to that one. And I fundamentally differ in my opinions from that. I think you have to look at the context very much more closely. You have to look where the monument's being placed, what its structural history was. The final form of a monument isn't necessarily what it was initially constructed, what it looked like when it was initially constructed. And then if you start looking at actual deposits within it, how the bones are being treated, how the artifacts are being treated, then you see there are different stories emerging.
So our categories are a curse as much as a blessing, or perhaps more than a blessing.
Yeah, that's right. So because you just otherwise you just follow the same, you can easily form, and it's not unique to archaeologists across disciplines. It's easy to form into a kind of pattern of saying this is like this. That's what this means. And I think actually what we should be doing is every time we get a new site, we should be thinking about the specifics of that site and then placing it with a narrative, not the other way around. I think that's a challenge for archaeologists, a challenge for lots of humanities. It's too easy just to try and build on what's existing there rather than look for what's new, different.
So if you were going to do a simple narrative for what's going on in that southwest corner. How would you characterize the Bronze Age
Well,
in terms of burial tradition? Can
well,
you do it at all, or is it
well, I mean, there are different things going on, and I think, and that's the one problem we still have is very, very refined chronologies, but there are definitely different trends going on throughout the period of, say, about 1900 to 1600 BC. There are different things going in with that. So there are the occasional burial which you could refer to as a high status burial, if you want to use that term.
Yeah.
But that doesn't really represent the majority of what's going on. And when you actually then drill down, what you find is there are lots of things, I think, which are to do with personhood in the Bronze Age, which there are different kinds of things being drawn on. So, for example, we were looking at a site recently which has a single piece of cremated bone in the bottom of a pot. So that raises the question, rather than just saying, oh, it's a early Bronze Age Wessex type burial because it's in a pot. My question is, why is there one piece of bone in there? What's happened to the rest of it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Why did they choose? Because they're obviously not. Obviously, if you're going to go to trouble to cremate a body, that's a lot of effort to do it. And personally, I don't think they're leaving bits of bone lying in piles all across the countryside. I think there are different processes going. So on occasions, that person's being divided up, and whether that's to do with its the partible nature of personhood, sharing out maybe amongst kin.
Oh yeah.
But other times you get another extreme is that you'll get a vessel with seemingly quite a lot of bone in it, like when we looked at Harlem Bay, I think it was, where there were multiple people in there. So there's been the reverse process gone on, and in actual fact, people have been brought together and then placed, but not the whole people, parts of them. So that's a different story again, isn't it? It's not, and then when you get grave goods in, or artifacts, I'd rather prefer the term, in barrows down here, very frequently they're not actually with the individual who's being interred either. They're within the mound, they're in a pit next to it. So I think we have to be careful about thinking that these things are personal possessions as opposed to community property or property belonging to other people who are contributing into the rites which are taking place on these sites.
So it's all a bit more messy and fluid than where
it's messy and fluid. That's a good way of saying it. Yes.
Why won't those Bronze Age people play by the rules that we
Yes.
make up? And then but that's the thing, isn't it? Is that there's actually very few societies that do play by these categories of a grave is a grave and that's what happens and you bury it. Many periods, but particularly that Bronze Age, there's a lot of circulation, it sounds like, of things going in and out of these burial deposits. They're not closed off, are they? They
No.
seem to be.
Exactly. That's the other thing. That's the other thing we found, actually, and I'll maybe get on to Whitehall's Kist in a bit. It seems to be, but also in other sites, I think there seems to be things being revisited as well. So whereas we may think of again in modern take on the kind of containing a body, putting it away in the ground forever, and then leaving it there, I think that's maybe been an alien concept, at least at some points in the Bronze Age as well, in that people may have wanted to add to things and take things away as well. And I think that may be part of the motivation behind some kiss burials. So they are boxes, but they're boxes that can be opened. So the capstones are left exposed, so they can lift them up and add, subtract, look at maybe. So I think there's these kinds of things going on. There's lots of trends going on here, as you say, messy.
Before we go on to the sort of kists and the inhumations in a little bit more detail, they're cremating the dead too. Is there a clear chronology established, or is it still looking a bit messy with when people are burning or burying or inhuming, as we sort of call it?
Well, the overwhelming, and this is a imitation south, the overwhelming majority of evidence we have from the southwest is for cremation, and that is largely because when you move away from the coastal areas or the few areas of kind of less acidic soil, nothing is going to survive that hasn't been burnt. So we have undoubtedly lost bodies. That said, it's interesting to note that we don't seem to have that many grave-shaped pits under barriers to hold inhumations, and even a lot of the kists. And we'd excavated one fairly recently at Penzance Heliport, which down on the edge of Penzance, and there we had a kist which looked to be a reasonable size, but when we opened it, in fact, it had been partitioned. So you could never have got a whole person in there intact. You'd have had to have passed, even if it held bones originally, unburnt bones originally, they'd have had to have been disassembled and stacked in some way to actually get them in to fit into the compartment. So again, so although I wouldn't say that that we've got the complete record of what was going on in terms of inhumation, I don't think it's as frequent as another areas.
That's really so. Okay, that's a good starting point. So burning the dead is the dominant right, and while there are biases, the archaeological record, if new sites coming up being excavated to modern conditions are still giving you that prevalence, that's really and that's really convincing. So when you do get and you get some burials with very little in it, but then you get these exceptional, I know it's not from Cornwall, but from the White Horse Hill, Dartmoor, that you're looking at a kist that's been built. You can re-access it, but these are like mini monuments as part of a broader structure, aren't they?
Yeah, that's right.
So is this a good point to go into some of that evidence, or is this can we talk about that a little bit?
Well, the White Horse kist.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm happy to talk about the White Horse kist. Yes, yeah, no, because that's an exceptional, and also the other interesting thing about the White Horse kist, I think, actually, is that that was a phenomenal site in many ways. The actual mound actually that was in, it wasn't that. I mean, it's natural peat swelling, so rather than a mound. So
right.
So it wasn't. They seemed to have picked an area where there was a kind of would have been a rise in the topography. So whether they thought that was was an earlier mound which they were reusing, which is quite an interesting thought, because that's again something that we do find in the Bronze Age fairly widespread across various parts of Britain. I think in Wales as well. When I was looking, there you get sort of natural kind of glacial features which can have burials put in them, and whether they're thinking those are works of ancestors or spirits or whatever, that's a moot point. But so the actual site wasn't that monumental. The kist itself would have stood out because we know they left the capstone exposed, but it was modest. But the interesting thing about it is that of all the hundreds of kists which have been excavated on across Dartmoor, there you could in Baring Gould's appendices of finds from Dartmoor, they'd probably all fit into a fairly large box, and that would be it. And the underlying assumption was that in some way this reflects a kind of impoverishment from what is going on to the east.
Yes.
But I think actually what we're seeing here is with White Horse demonstrates is that, and I think Linda Hercombe put this well, is that what we're looking at is the rare example where you're actually looking at what she would term the missing majority, because you've got very finely crafted organic material at White Horse which survived because they picked a peat mound for it to go into, rather than creating a stony one or a soily one that would dried out. Because it was in this kind of semi-wet environment, the thing survived. And I would imagine, in fact, all those sites across the moor may well have had, or many of them may have had, comparable assemblages within them. So these very finely crafted sashes and wristbands and ear studs and whatnot may not have been that atypical. They may have been what people were wearing, and they're just maybe less bothered about copper, and tin objects, which they may have been exporting elsewhere.
So it's a window onto a world rather than being a special burial of a high status individual.
I'd say. I mean, obviously she was a significant person when she was, interred, but again, not complete. Only a third, I think, of her. So again, we got this question of where did the other 2/3 go? And obviously the artifacts she was with were, were very very well made, and so she may have been a person of social standing, or the people who were at least putting the stuff around had access to nice things. But how exceptional she was is a moot point.
So we have these burial traditions. How do they fit into the broader? Because this is something I know you've addressed. How does this fit into the settlement landscape? Because obviously we have better preserved Bronze Age sites from the uplands of the southwest, from Dartmoor, Bodmin Moor. But it's not that people aren't just living on the tops of hills. That's just where it happens to survive. But how do we contend with that bias that we've lost a lot of the lowland areas, or are we able to redress that balance now with the recent field work?
Yeah, and I think we're beginning to. I think the general rule of thumb still holds, which is that the settlement record for the time period when those kinds of burials are being made. So we're talking about a time frame about 1900 to 1600 BCE. So you've got during that period, we've got a lot of evidence for kind of burial and kind of ceremonial monuments, but the settlement record is comparatively porous, which is very interesting. We are picking up more traces of it, but and with recent works on the A30 and other schemes we've been doing, we are getting. But the interesting thing is the structures we are uncovering are very, very, very much more flimsy, short term than the kind of typical roundhouse settlement that you encounter as you walk across Dartmoor or Bodmin Moor, the stone built houses, or indeed in the lowlands, where we've got a lot of evidence now from Middle Bronze Age settlement, very, very substantial roundhouses obviously being built there, but there isn't that intensity of emphasis being placed on house construction. They can build structures, but they're not putting they're all into domestic architecture. So we've got some very interesting sites in Penwith, for example. In Senham, we found what looked like a kind of Bender type structure, and we've had a couple more turned up since then. And I think probably on the A30, some recent work that's been done there. When we get some dates, we'll find there's a couple of structures there also fall in the early Bronze Age. But it's just an emphasis change, which is interesting. So they're spending their person hours building barrows, erecting standing stones, that kind of thing, rather than investing in houses.
And in terms of funerary monuments are multi-staged and complex, and many generations they're revisiting. How do standing stones fit into the picture now? I'm a little out of date on all of this.
And that's something that's proved to be entirely. I suspect they run right through. To be honest, this is still a problem.
Okay.
Because standing stones are just so hard to date. There are certainly some which are going up in the Bronze Age. There are others though which seem more like the Neolithic. So basically, and then of course you get ones being like Menstgruffer in the west of Cornwall, just to complicate things, where they go up in the post-Roman period as well. So or seemingly the inscription on it anyway. You'll be familiar with that one. But
absolutely. Yeah. So you have a landscape of relatively ephemeral settlements, and people are, obviously these are just so people, obvious point, but farming societies, they have animals domesticated long term. This is nothing new. They're using metals, but they're not despite obviously tin coming from Cornwall, there's not vast amounts of it going into the graves.
That's interesting. That is interesting.
Is that a fair characterization?
Yeah. I think that's a fair character, and it's also very interesting that how little. I mean, there is I'll add the caveat that tin doesn't preserve terribly well. The Whitehorse Kiss is an example of that. The tin objects were very powdery and required a lot of conservation. Yeah. That aside, it's interesting though that there isn't as much tin circulating around, going into graves, or indeed metal objects, because you'd have thought that for the early Bronze Age you could whack out a copper dag, quite easily, because then with a flat mold or something else, and you've got the resources there. We know they've got the resources there. very excitingly, being involved with the Ancient Tin project, it's quite clear that I think from this work that tin starts very early in the southwest. So they could have done, they could have put a lot more metal into graves than they did, and they're not. And I'm wondering if that is because it's because they're exporting the wrong way, exchanging is probably the wrong word. Maybe some kind of gift exchange. They probably want the nice fabrics, the woven textiles, the style of stuff we see in the White Horse Kist, because that's less readily available. You may have metal, but you might want to exchange those ores for amber beads, for for other things that aren't there.
Yeah, values are going to be relative to localities
exactly.
and regions, aren't they? Yeah.
Yeah, and I remember reading while I was working on the White Horse Kist, actually, some records, I think, for accounts from ancient Greece, where finely woven textiles were literally worth their weight in gold. So if you've got metals, in the Southwest Peninsula, as we know they did, and the Carnan Valley gold, which is in the Nebra Disk, is another indicator. If you know that people have got this, what are they going to want? Maybe they're going to want stuff they don't have readily to hand, so they want those nice tunics, bear skins. Yeah.
Yes. So has there been any obviously there's new archaeological discoveries happening all the time and you can't talk about them, as we said, but are there any in the perhaps startling discoveries of the last decade and a half? I mean, obviously the White Horse Hill burial is an example because of the preservation. Are there any other finds that might have hit the broader radar?
I think I mentioned Ancient Tin. That's going to project that's going to come out of early summer, and I think that's going to be very important when it comes out as well for the early Bronze Age and the Southwest. I think so. Keep an eye open for that. So that will be appearing in Antiquity. I'm not going to it's that just yet, but so that will definitely be a big one. We're also at the moment been trying to look at sediments in some of our sites to see if we can extract ADNA as well. If we're just on the cusp of that, so if that works, that will be a major forward. And I think what I'm finding most exciting about now is actually will be in the next 10 years, as these sciences which can look at isotopes, DNA, things which we haven't been able to do in the past because of the poor organic remains, now being able to extract these things from other materials like ceramics, and increasing as they can do more with cremated bone. I think these are going to be the things which are going to be very, very interesting coming online in the future. And we're involved with another project at the moment where we're looking for traces of metallurgy on stone tools, which will take things forward. We're also recently we've done a couple of sites doing PIX RF, looking for traces of metallurgy within structures. Because again, tin actually working tin and copper leaves almost no visible archaeological traces, but we can get the traces where it's gone into been incorporated into in situ sediments. So this is all the kind of thing which is exciting me at the moment. We've got again another project we're involved with is we've been sending shards of pottery off recently to see if we can extract information about what vessels are being used for. So that kind of lipid analysis is getting so much better. We'll know a lot more about diets as well. So I think these are the things which are exciting me most. It's almost the micro type of stuff that we can do.
But it all adds up to a bigger picture and a transforming picture as these new applications come on board and we can extract them. I suppose I don't know how to frame this, because obviously we have to be sensitive about how we say things, but what in terms of the bigger challenges faced the study of, say, the Bronze Age of the Southwest, what would you say is the biggest sort of misinformation out there that you encounter online? Because obviously maybe you escaped the Graham Hancocks and the big hitting lunatics, but are there any areas where you feel there are popular misconceptions, stereotypes?
Well, I think stereotypes, I think that's just a problem for prehistory generally, and I think it's
Yeah,
partly. I mean, I think it's partly because of the way that archaeology has developed in Britain, probably in the last 30 years, I guess. I think, and I don't know if you agree with this, but I think the commercial archaeology has gone down in one direction, which is very kind of dealing with dealing with the massive amount of developments that happens, and the amount of evidence coming from that is really exciting.
yeah,
And I'm not making a particular point about Cornwall, and this is a kind of general thing.
yes,
It's really exciting, but it's very focused on technical output, should we say?
yeah,
But I think slightly, and I don't want to be critical but I think the other thing is, I think that there isn't that kind of middle sector between the kind of technical work that's done and the academic research is done, and I think
yeah.
it's that middle ground. It's that we don't seem to have, and I don't want to do anybody a disservice who fits into,
No.
but we don't seem to have the kind of Aubrey Burl type writers. Do you know
Oh,
what I mean?
yeah.
Or even the Mortimer Wheelers, who kind of told those kind of stories which ordinary people would pick up off the shelf. And I was in a couple of years ago, we were in a very well-known archaeological site, and I went to the bookshop there, which one I used to frequent years and years ago, decades ago, and I couldn't find a decent general textbook. So you literally go from really good academically written stuff, and then you get really kind of the Graham Hancocks, and there's nothing very much in between. So although I can see why people get annoyed with Graham Hancock, and but I think partly because archaeologists have kind of, and I don't know why, have kind of backed away from that kind of discourse. I don't know why that is. I don't know if you agree with that. You may not agree, but it's just my perception of
it. No, it's interesting. It's interesting. I mean, I certainly it's a topic that comes up again and again in my conversations, and I keep changing my opinion depending on who I'm talking to. Not because I'm just completely fickle, but because it matters in different ways in different places. So I'm trying to get my Cornish Bronze Age hat on and thinking a lot of areas it doesn't affect, and then but you're still thinking, well, where's the narrative being written from? And I end up being so what I'm trying to say is sometimes I get more frustrated with the academic situation itself. Sometimes our common enemies in the mad world of fringe or pseudo archaeology are the enemy, and certainly from my period in the early Middle Ages, I think a lot of the problems come from within the discipline and within that there is nonsense out there, but it's not that big best-selling book nonsense. It's online trickle of hateful comments in comment sections on social media. So it's difficult, isn't it, to know where? But I think you're right. I think there are some that have tried to do that, and I must admit I've been very bad at keeping up with all of the popular books, because people approach me with misconceptions, and students say things and I go, hang on, where's that from? And I go, oh, it's not Alex Roberts' fault or Mike Pitts' fault, but it's something they've said that has then appeared on a YouTube channel that then appeared, and then they're getting about 17th hand, and so yes, of course I agree with you, and I think there's more we can do in that public sphere, whether it's book writing or having these conversations so people know where people can find the research, and creating that interface, because not everyone is par with Google Scholar or Academia Edu or let alone paywall journals, and people are therefore turning to those nonsense sources. So I can only agree with you. I just think sometimes
I don't know how we resolve. It's not saying I don't know how to resolve either. Actually, I think, and also, I mean, I think it's interesting, because also what academics, or not academics, archaeologists generally think people are consuming as well. I think it's problematic because I don't think we necessarily know what people are going to go for or want either. It's interesting actually, because when you do see, and I was talking to somebody yesterday who was asking me questions about a site, and but they, I think lay people find it difficult to know where to go, and you'll still see stuff quoted, I don't know, from from the 60s and 70s, what archaeologists were saying then, because that's the last,
There's a lot of time
that
lag, isn't there?
yeah.
Well, the example I use of when I get things wrong online, and I keep using this again and again, is because I'm not a specialist in British prehistory, is I went recently last summer to a certain monument near Avebury that's the biggest human-made burial mound in Europe, apparently, according to the heritage sign. And it says it on the as a subheading of the book, the English Heritage book, that's only 9 years old. So I said, just to send, hey, audience, it's the largest mound in Europe. And somebody from Poland just said, hey, but what about that article in, where was it, Nature Communications, about some Italian archaeologists who've got a Bronze Age mound that's in the Po Valley that's bigger? And I went, really? Okay. And I looked it up and I did a follow-up video going, oh, yeah, I'm wrong. According to this paper peer reviewed, they've done this new GPR analysis of this mound that's got a castle and a church on top of it. And it's all human made. And it's like, but I said, but Silbury Hill's taller. So they may be wider, but we're taller. You know, but it's my broader point is I got it wrong, and people are finding stuff faster than I know about for my supposed area of expertise, and there's a very healthy thing there, but also it's a very disconcerting thing that there is who knows that stuff is out there. What's their how do they navigate the misinformation to find some helpful tool to access this? Now I'm never probably ever going to do active research in the Bronze Age of Northern Italy, and I'll take on I can't evaluate the detail of their survey work, but it just shows that there's great blessings with this access of information, but also challenges of working out what to say and how to build our narratives, because people have very different knowledge bases. So if you're telling a developer, they're saying, okay, in 10 seconds tell me everything I didn't know about the Bronze Age, and you go, well, or a public talk. But then you can, and we do have existing audiences talk to local societies who want an hour. They want that detail, so it's a difficult balancing act, isn't it? And we're never going to get it right.
Difficult, yeah. And I think actually also you mentioned paywalls, and I think that's different because obviously you're right. A lot of people now consume online, and I think where and I noticed actually with university libraries as well, actually, where years ago you just trot along to your local library and it would have an archaeology section or something like that. Now those kind of specialist things have pretty much disappeared from many ordinary libraries. Now you're more like to have an internet cafe zone. So and they're certainly not carrying journals anymore. I mean, no. I don't know what Chester's like, but I know a lot of the universities now are going for online subscription rather than having stuff on shelves. Then that automatically excludes a large number of people, who don't have access to those resources anymore, because it's quite costly. I mean, I was looking at something yesterday. I thought, well, yes, I'll go and look at that paper. It's not a journal I subscribe to, and it was something like $30 for 24 hours access. And I thought, well, almost half the subscription for this is like a 15-page paper. So I'm not going to go to a rant about it, but that again is disincentivizing people ordinary people who may Google something, everything, and think, oh, well, I can't read that. I'll just read what is available, and then that might be an approximation of the truth. Because they can't look at
the Bronze Age of the Southwest, then we've got some exciting new projects. We've got some exciting existing knowledge bases, and we get up our data and our understanding is getting better. But we also have some challenges of the usual challenges of resourcing archaeology, of sharing archaeology. What do you think of the next sort of big challenges or opportunities coming in the world that you're facing?
I hate to try and guess that, to be honest, because it's so the last 10 years have been, or 15 years have been quite challenging, and people have had to have been resourceful about doing things. I think generally, obviously, since the financial crash, was that 2010? So and things haven't got easier in many ways. So it's just a matter of being resourceful, taking opportunities when you can, and building connections. I think that's the thing that's important, and something that worries me slightly, because is that I think Richard Bradley wrote a really good paper back in about 2011, something like that, in the SOCANT, called the Bridging Two Cultures, I think he called it, or something like that. And that almost came at the cusp just as those bridges started to kind of get more and more shaky. I thought there's a bit of irony in that. And I think it's that it's not, archaeology needs to be less sectorial and less siloed in between the different parts of its discipline, because the more interaction, the more we can kind of benefit each other, and stay abreast of what's happening. Because for a discipline to be healthy, people need, on whatever bit they're working in, need to be refreshing about what other people are doing within the discipline as well. So I'd say that was the thing that I'd like to see more of. I remember going to France, I don't know what it was, for a conference back in about 2020, I think it was. And I was really impressed actually how, talking to people from IMRAP, and from their university sector and CNRS as well, and the amount of collaboration between the different things seemed to be, at least on the surface, seemed to be far greater than and far easier, far smoother than it is here, where it's much more on personal contact and
yes,
who to put it bluntly.
I think that's a fair. That's from what limited experience I've had. I think from my perspective, I totally confirm that despite calls for the contrary, we are still very siloed, and we try our best individually, but it's not about individuals, it's about the broader structures in which we work. And yes, we should be more French in that respect, at least.
Yeah. I think the more talking that people do between the disciplines, with sections within the discipline, the better, because keeping up to date with things is important, whether that's methods and theory or new sites, or whether it's keeping abreast of kind of latest academic developments. That's important, because that theory should be informing what's done in the field as well. So I think it's keeping those links open and information flowing both ways. So people aren't talking when they're in front of a class about some site that was excavated 50 years ago, and vice versa. Somebody when they're on site isn't thinking about the latest technique as something as the one when they were an undergraduate.
Absolutely. Although it sounds like some of these very old sites still have a sort of some utility, but no, we've got to keep up with the new data and the new analyses and the new interpretations based on those analyses. Thank you so much, Andy. It's been really great talking to you. And do you have any final thoughts or any final reflections for our viewers and listeners before we close things?
Well, I mean, I just encourage people to engage as much as they can within, and we've got some down in the southwest. We've got some great archaeological societies, and I should have mentioned that when you were talking earlier. Actually, is that one of the things that I think the archaeology societies in the southwest have really stepped up in the last decade. They provide a lot of the outreach. So Devon and Cornwall, in particular, ones I've most of it with, but they've really stepped up to provide that kind of public engagement side of things. I mean, the Cornwall Archaeological Society, which I'm most closely linked with, there's so much now online for people to get in. So it's keeping in touch with that side of things, I think. And I think that's the way.
That's a really good point.
Positive.
There's a lot of volunteer, avocational, amateur, whatever you want to call it, participation and passion for archaeology in the southwest, and that's an important element too. And we'll put links in the description to any of your key publications and links to those societies so people know where to find them. But just wanted to say thank you. So it's been a real pleasure and a privilege.
It's been great talking to you. Great talking to you, Howard. Very good to see you.
Sadly, we're all going to die. But while you're waiting, why not follow Archaeodeath? Subscribe now on YouTube.